Hi, and welcome everyone to this webinar, Gender Aspects of the War in Ukraine. My name is Amanda Sonesson, and I'm the project coordinator for the Sweden for Eastern Partnership project. Sweden for Eastern Partnership is a Forum Civ run project that focuses on different aspects of civil society in the Eastern Partnership region, including Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine. And today's webinar is organized within the frames of said project. If you want more details about what we do, we will post links to our webpage and newsletter in the event description on Facebook afterwards. We'll also add these to the video description on Forum Civ's YouTube channel. If you have any questions or comments, you can post these in the comment section on Facebook or YouTube at any time, and we'll do our best to include these at the end of this 60-minute seminar. Except for the horrors, traumas, and violence that war inflicts on everything and everyone that it touches, war changes and impacts all aspects of life. In Ukraine, the reality of war has been present since 2014 with the Russian annexation of Crimea and ensuing war in eastern Ukraine. Since Russia's attempted full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, not a week has passed without news reports on how Ukrainian women now make up the logistical backbone of the war, how they defend their country, orchestrate social care, and keep the wheels of society running. At the same time, we are also getting constant reports on how sexual violence is being used by Russian soldiers against not only women, but also children and men, and of how human traffickers utilize the situation to enslave people crossing the borders. Ukrainian women play a fundamental and decisive part in this war, yet we rarely stop to ask ourselves how this will affect the outcome of the war, how it changes how we look and understand war from a gender perspective, and how it impacts gender equality in Ukraine. To try and answer some of these questions, we have invited 3 experts to talk about gendered aspects of war today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Lisa Birval, award-winning journalist, publicist, and author to no less than 7 books, the latest one being Slava Ukraini, in which you follow and interview Ukrainian women about the ongoing war. We also have Jessica Pujanrell, who works as a policy advisor for the Swedish organization Kvinna till Kvinna. You are working with women's rights organizations all around the world, especially focused on women's rights in conflict-affected countries and on women's and civil society's participation in peace building. And last but not least, Anna Kvitt, originally a sociologist at Kyiv School of Economics and currently a visiting research fellow at University College London at the Department of European and International Social and Political Studies. And you focus on gender equality and women's rights in the military sector of Ukraine during wartime in your research. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll dive right into it. And I will start by asking you, Lisa. You've spent the last year traveling back and forth between Ukraine and Sweden. And you've met and interviewed a lot of different women. How would you say that the perception of Ukrainian women joining the military and contributing to the war effort has changed this last year?
The perception in the West, you mean, or in the world, or in Ukraine?
In Ukraine.
Well, so as you know, this war was going on before as well as a regional conflict. And women have already participated for many years. They've even built special women's veteran war centers that I visited in Lviv, for example. So women have played an active part in it and have very much been seen as comrades, as if you wish. And there has also been kind of minor revolution, female revolution within the Ukrainian army, brought on by documentary and a project called Invisible Battalion, where women highlighted the need for female adjusted physical gear, for example, for the women in the army, but also lobbied to have access to the same positions as men, to receive better rights and so on. So this has been ongoing. But what has changed now is, of course, that although many women want to underscore in Ukraine that this is not a new conflict, a full-scale military invasion is, of course, something completely different. Not least because of mobilization. that all men between the ages of 18 and 60, well, of course, with some exclusions, have been drafted, a general draft. So this means that women living in the unoccupied regions that could live their life completely normally before the full-scale invasion have now probably seen their husbands, boyfriends, or girlfriends, for that matter, in some cases, being sent to the front. So the view of the women is that they are equal to the men. They are an extremely important part of defending Ukrainian sovereignty. And they are more and more, not least for practical reasons, being heard in their demands for equal treatment within the army, simply because there is no need for the military leadership not to grant them these kind of wishes anymore. It's an extremely dramatic situation, of course. And it's important to note that women in the Ukrainian army, they were already one of the Western world's most female, gender equal, you may say, armies, even before the full-scale invasion. So this is not something that has happened overnight. And now all of these figures are very hard to know specifically. We should remember in this discussion, especially during an ongoing full war. But it's talk about between 20 and 25% are the female numbers of the Ukrainian army. And this is exceptionally high. The United States has 15%. And as I mentioned in my book, Russia has not even 3%. And these 3% that they are women in office duties. And so it's very interesting to see that in the battlefield right now, you do have one of the most gender equal armies in the world actually facing an almost 100% male dominated and also very ill-equipped in other ways Russian army. So it matters on the battleground as well, even if we are not here to speak about military strategies, but more of a gender perspective. But it's important to take note of that. They simply have so many more soldiers. And it's even thought by some experts that one of the reasons that it went so badly in President Putin's planning of this invasion is because he completely neglected to count the women that were able to be drafted and able to join the physical fight. He he's leading such an authoritarian, male neo-fascist chauvinist regime that he just looked at the numbers of how many men can they draft in Ukraine and discounted the women. I'm not sure if this is true, but I know the experts watching Moscow for many, many years have pointed this out, and it's fascinating. Talk about discounting women and seeing them as invisible.
You mentioned the invisible battalion, and correct me if I'm wrong, Anna, you're one of the contributing researchers to this project, or you did participated in before. Would you care to comment what you think about the perception of women joining the military? How it has changed, and how women's perception has changed?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this event. It's very important to discuss this whole women's resistance and women's involvement into the defense efforts in Ukraine and all of it. I'm a part of Invisible Battalion project as a researcher. It has different dimensions, this project. It has a research focus, and then they made movies and advocacy campaigns. And what I wanted to say about the attitudes towards women in the defense sector, as mentioned before, it is indeed true that more women are joining armed forces of Ukraine. And in fact, the number of military women in the armed forces of Ukraine has more than doubled since 2014. Since the time when this war has, in fact, started, and there were two waves of women joining actively armed forces of Ukraine. It was at the beginning in 2014, and then in 2022 after the full-scale invasion. and the attitudes towards women in the military sector have changed dramatically over these years. For example, in 2014, presence of women on the front line and on combat positions was not envisaged by Ukrainian legislation, it was not acceptable back at that time. But the policies have changed, and but also the perception of women in the military has changed, because according to the survey of adult population of Ukraine in 2018, I think 53% of adult population of Ukraine said that they think that women and men should have equal rights in the armed forces of Ukraine. And in 2022, already 80% of population thought that the Ukrainian military should be gender equal and women and men should have equal rights. So we can see the very rapid and dramatic changes of the attitudes towards women in the military of Ukraine.
What are some of the, if we continue with you, Anna, what are some of the greatest challenges that Ukrainian women are faced with when they join the military? Elise already mentioned some issues, but yeah.
Yeah, there are lots of challenges, and still, at the beginning, in 2014 and 15, women were, I would say, strongly discouraged to join the armed forces of Ukraine, and so that they joined volunteer battalions. Well, they joined the armed forces officially, but also volunteer battalions, which was easier for them. One of the key, now they are officially allowed to serve at all positions in the military sector. So it's easier now, but still one of the key challenges is gender stereotypes. I think it's one of the key problems because it affects attitudes towards women in the society and in the military. It affects policy making process and it affects policy implementation. Another challenge would be inclusive infrastructure, because at the level of laws and policies, women have much more rights now than they had 9 years ago. But changes of infrastructure requires more resources, more time. There are some changes happening at the moment, but still, for example, provision of the healthcare services for women in the military still requires improvement. Female military uniform is still should be provided by the armed forces of Ukraine. They do provide military uniform, but it doesn't fit because it's not tailored to according to the proportions of a female body. Anti-harassment policies, they must be introduced and implemented. There has been work done on development of policies, anti-harassment policies, but they haven't been implemented yet. They haven't been adopted yet, really. And for example, codes of conduct, they still are mainly male-focused. They need to be reformulated. And then women's leadership in the sector, it's another challenge. From interviews with women in the military and veteran women, we hear that they say they face obstacles with career development in the military sector. And this is another area that should be improved with time.
I have a last question for you before we move on. And I'm wondering if you could describe if there has been any concrete challenges to policies and laws in Ukraine related to the military and how it has changed or impacted on gender equality for better or for worse, I guess.
I'm sorry, challenges to policy?
No, changes. Sorry. Changes to policies.
Yeah, of course. So there have been many changes. And there was a big progress towards a legal framework that regulates women's presence in the armed forces of Ukraine. For example, the key ones, I could say, is the cancellation of forbidden professions for women. 9 years ago, there were 450 forbidden professions for women in Ukraine, and some of them were professions in the defense and security sector. And also over these years, women got access to all combat positions in the armed forces of Ukraine. They received access to all types of military education, which was not possible a few years ago. And this is a big progress, because having access to military education means that probably we will have more women officers, and this in turn should contribute to more women at the higher ranks and at the more decision making positions in the military. Then infrastructure is developing. Positions of gender advisors are introduced. Then another new policy is that men were allowed to take paternity leave in the military. Military men were allowed to take paternity leave in case their partner is also on the military service in Ukraine. Before, women were, if both partners were in the military, only women could take this leave. So basically, she should have sacrificed her career and take care of a child. But now they can decide who will be spending time with the child for a certain period of time. Yeah, so I think these are the very key changes, but yeah, a lot has been done to improve women's rights in the defense sector of Ukraine.
Do you think, just to add on to that, so a lot of things has happened over the last few years. Is there anything that you see as pressing that should change in order to improve gender equality in the military?
Yeah, I think it is important to implement the new policies and laws properly, because at the moment, I understand that the capacity is very limited. We are in the middle of a real war. But if we look at the implementation of some programs or policies or laws, we can see that there are certain areas, certain aspects that require improvement and more attention. So basically, not to do it only on paper, but in the real life as well. And to be more precise, I would say that women need better infrastructure in the military sector to make their military service as comfortable as possible, because they are, yes, they are doing a lot and they deserve to have the best conditions.
Yeah, and proper and secure equipment.
Yeah, okay. Exactly.
So I wanted to turn to you, Jessica. I know that this might be well off in the future, or actually we don't know at all, but I was thinking about mediation and peace building. What will be the effects if women are not taking part in these processes for shaping the future of Ukraine?
Yes, thank you. Well, just to think a little bit about that. Usually we, as an organization, support women's rights organizations and women who are part of peace building processes to be able to make sure that women have their needs and their ideas put forward in these processes. But in this case, because of the dynamics of the war, because obviously Russia launching a full-scale invasion on another country, it has been basically impossible to have any meaningful negotiations or mediation work, as we all know. And it has been extremely sensitive to even try to propose that Ukraine should negotiate with Russia, or that any peace building activities should take place at all across the borders. So the usual peace building work and mediation work that we try to encourage has just not been possible so far. Some of the things that we have been able to support is rather things inside of Ukraine. And so, for example, we've been supporting initiatives by women mediators who've been carrying out local mediation efforts, working, for example, with integration of IDPs in new areas in order to prevent local outbursts of conflict within the conflict. And then, of course, also we've been able to support women's rights organizations to do all the other types of work in order to keep society together during wartime, which is also extremely important for what happens after war. So, a lot of women's rights organizations and LGBTQI organizations have been part of the relief efforts in a very big way. They've responded to needs of women on the ground, and in terms of acting as first responders, they have been evacuating people, reached out to vulnerable groups in remote and occupied areas with medicines and necessities. They've also participated in protection efforts. Local women's shelters have become absolutely essential in giving protection, medical, psychological, and legal help for women and children who have experienced both conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence, but also other forms of violence. And of course, Ukrainian women's rights organizations and LGBTQI organizations have also kept doing a lot of important advocacy to make sure that international donor community understand the specific needs and challenges of women in the country. And this is the sort of work that will be important that we keep supporting so that these organizations can continue to be part of any sort of consultations and dialogues about the future of the country, regardless of whether it's peace processes or specific peace negotiations or not. There are important discussions going on, of course, right now on the recovery of Ukraine and the different types of recovery funding. And we need to have clear gender perspectives and include views of minority groups in shaping how we build the future Ukraine, and to make sure that there is an inclusive society after the war. So we will see, of course, what happens in the future in terms of peace negotiations and mediation work. But regardless, there are a lot of important political processes right now that are shaping the future of Ukraine, where women need to be heard and women's perspectives need to be included. And so we try to support and encourage that work as we go along.
Mm. And just to follow up on that, Anna mentioned that it's important to get more women into leadership positions in the military. Do you think that this is something that could affect or shape the future peace, maybe, or yeah?
Yeah, I think that it could be important, perhaps. I think that a lot of countries that are post-conflict countries and that have become more militarized, they don't usually perceive women's knowledge as important. Women's perspective and women's knowledge are usually perceived even less important than in other societies. So it will be extra important to make sure that women have equal political participation in the post-war Ukraine, and perhaps the fact that women has actually taken part in a very active way in the warfaring could play an important part here and give women a leverage in terms of having bigger political participation in the future Ukraine.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the Maidan revolution, this is exactly what happened. Women's participation in the struggle for independence has given them much more important positions in politics, culture, civil society, and so on than before. And this is what usually happens in most societies, I would say, when there is a struggle for independence. So hopefully we will see the same, that they just gain extra strength from being such active participants in this war, and not just on the front lines, but in so many different roles. Like I said, in civil society, leading protests across the world, as writers, journalists, lobbyists, so many. They are active in so many different fields. But I think it's important in this discussion that we don't focus so much on what Ukraine can do to increase equality within their army, because we have problems with that in Sweden too. Right now, the biggest problem facing all women in Ukraine is that Russia has invaded them and are raping their women and killing their children. So I think that it's good if this gender development work within the Ukrainian army keeps going, and obviously it's like this with all authoritarian structures, right? The military, the police, and so on. The more women you have in leadership positions, the easier it is to introduce successful gender equality policies. It's exactly the same in Sweden and everywhere else. But the more pressing issues, I think, are human trafficking for sexual purposes, and the forced adoptions of Ukrainian children, and the wartime rapes by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian women and girls as a form of psychological terror to the civilian population.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking that we should not focus too much on sexual violence. We know that as you said, that it's a well-known problem and much reported on. But I was thinking that we should focus on, and I wanted to ask you, Jessica, about increasing gender-based violence as a consequence of war and trauma, because I think that this is a topic that is not, it's also a form of sexual violence in a sense, and it's a topic that is not so often talked about when it comes to war. We know that, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, like, we know that there are high levels of both stress and violence in a society also raises the levels of gender-based violence. And I was thinking back, during the pandemic, it was possible to talk about how the stress of the quarantine raised the risk of domestic violence. But when it comes to domestic violence increasing as a consequence of war, I think that there is another stigma, because then you have someone who is looked upon as a war hero by society, and who might be beating his partner. And I just wanted to raise this topic here and see what do you think, if there is anything we can do to change this situation and how to remove the stigma?
Yes. Well, of course, as mentioned, the conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence committed against Ukrainian women by Russian soldiers have been reported on, which is great, and have come to the surface almost from the very beginning of the full-scale invasion. And it has actually been prioritized more than it usually is in conflicts, both by the Ukrainian government and the international community. So this is extremely positive and welcome, and we hope that we can have some good investigations into this and bring that to court. But at the same time, we are also hearing that there is an increase in other forms of gender-based violence as well, including domestic violence, which is partly due to the fact that mostly men, come back from the front line with serious psychological problems and traumas, and are maybe not getting the right type of rehabilitation that is needed, and psychological help, and is taking this out on wives, partners, children, and so on. And this type of violence is, as you said, is not getting as much attention. And our partners have also reported that many women are not getting help from the police for this type of violence, and instead they are told to sort of put up with it because their men are war heroes. And this is a massive problem, which could lead to a huge backsliding of women's situation and women's rights in Ukraine in years to come, unless it is addressed. And I would say that it is, of course, resources are extremely stretched during wartime. And so not everything is considered priority. But it is also this thing that it is extremely sensitive to talk about violence committed within your own group during wartime. And it's not unique for Ukraine, of course. But in this case, it means that it's okay to speak out about the horrid crimes committed by Russian soldiers, but it's not really okay to talk about the violence perpetrated by one's own soldiers, since they are war heroes and they are the ones who everyone should support and celebrate. And we need to address this in order to get away from the idea that you're supposed to turn a blind eye to crimes committed by your own soldiers, and we need to instead have more of a victims survivor-centered approach, which means that everyone who has been subjected to violence deserves to get help regardless of who the perpetrator is. And that needs to happen now so that women who are suffering at the hands of their partners can get help. And of course, despite the fact that it is war, it is also important to work to continue to support those who are doing the long-term work of changing attitudes around men's violence against women, also in Ukraine. And Ukraine actually ratified the Istanbul Convention, which is the International Convention on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, in May last year, in the middle of the war. So that is a great sign that this can be prioritized also during this war. But it also needs to be implemented in order to address this increase of violence and domestic violence.
Would any of you, Lisa or Anna, be interested in commenting on that?
No.
No. Okay, then I will move on. So, and this is a question, we can start with you, Anna, maybe. What do you think the implications of this war will have on the ensuing future gender equality in Ukraine? How will it affect gender equality, the work towards gender equality?
It's a very big question. I think many of us are thinking about it now. And well, we know that there are, from other countries, from other wars, we know that there is a very big risk of a rollback in the women's rights after the end of the war. But I really want to be, I really want to see the ray of light in this situation and see the positive, the hopes that it will be getting better, or at least at the level as it is now. So I think that over the last years, we have, in Ukraine, there has been lots of changes in the policies and regulations done, as I mentioned, and as a colleague just now said, like, for example, adoption of a ratification of the Istanbul Convention. So the legal framework is being reshaped and is being improved constantly. And we, for example, have already the second action plan on implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution Women, Peace and Security, which was revised during the full-scale invasion last summer, which also demonstrates us a lot of political commitment towards ensuring or improving gender equality situation in Ukraine. We also have strategy on gender equality until 2030. So Ukrainian government is taking a lot of commitments to ensure women and men have equal rights in Ukrainian society, even during the war. So I think it's still being a priority, and I hope it will continue being like this.
What was this?
And also,
I just wanted to ask if the gender equality policy that you said that you have adopted until 2030, was it adopted before the full-scale invasion?
It was adopted around that time. I don't remember when. I think maybe before it, but not a long time ago. And also, on the other hand, if we look at not at the policies, but at the real life, this war has given Ukrainian women very different experience. It was, well, the circumstances are very unfortunate. It's not it's a war, but at the same time, Ukrainian women are being very involved into the resistance and defense efforts at different levels, in the army, as civil society, at the level of in the political sphere, and I think it showed that it gave them this experience that they can be effective in this critical situation, and to some extent, it showed what they can do, what they are capable of, in spite of everything. And yeah, I think this experience cannot be taken away. Like it was empowerment to a certain level, maybe forced, but it was. And it also, if we look at the society's perception of women is changing into a better way. They recognize that women can be, for example, they should deserve equal rights in the military sector, or women can be effective at certain positions. So it's the process. It was forced, but it has some positive outcomes, and I hope that it will also contribute to the fact that when the war is over, there will be still progress towards greater gender equality in Ukrainian society.
I think I saw you nodding a bit, Lisa. Do you want to continue?
No, I think it's interesting what she says here, and especially given the historical parallels, when we see that women have played active parts in wars and conflicts. They have strengthened their positions, but they've also kind of fast forwarded history. In many cases, during the 19th and 20th century, you would see women gaining rights that weren't even considered for them, that weren't even up for discussion, so to say, before war broke out. So it does really, although no one wants a war, it is important to highlight the positive consequences, if you wish, of these horrific wars. Although women are particularly vulnerable when it comes to things like wartime rape and human trafficking, there is also this fact that when they are active participants on the home front as well as on the military front, they are sort of seen both by themselves and the rest of the population, also the male population, as kind of growing into the role of being active citizens. They are active co-shapers of this new democratic nation. So it's again, it's so interesting if you compare it to women's much more passive role in Russia, and women as a kind of active democracy builders in Ukraine. It's truly fascinating, and it's very inspiring to see them being so active in defending their nation, I think.
I think that you mentioned this in your book, and it's a reference back to Svetlana Alexievich book, The Unwomanly Face of War, where she describes at the end of the book how, or she doesn't, the women who are interviewed in this book describe how after the war finishes, they've been participating as medics and snipers and combating along with men, and as the war has finished or finishes, they are told by men and society that they should just forget their own participation, and that it shouldn't, that no one wants to marry like a sniper or someone who fought in the war. It's like unwomanly. I'm just playing the devil's advocate here a little bit. Like, could this happen in again in Ukraine, that there is like there is a movement forward, but also at the same time there is a movement like kind of backwards towards more traditional gender roles?
No, I don't think so, but it's an interesting question. You have to remember, Alexievich's book came out for the first time in 1985, 40 years after the end of the Second World War. She spoke to women as they were of older middle age or of elder age. So this was very much looking back at the past. It was a whole different society, both Soviet Russia and Cold War Russia. So was very different societies where everything that didn't fit into the state's narrative was quiet. You have to remember that, for example, the Russian narrative to this day is that they saved Europe from Hitler's Third Reich. This is like the official version that they even teach school children. So you wouldn't, there were no like allied forces or anything. They were the liberators of Europe. So this is something else. This, Russia is a society controlled by state propaganda, by one untruthful narrative. It's impossible today that happens. Ukraine is a wholly different modern society, but we also have things like social media, free media, both inside and outside Ukraine. So it's not possible to suppress it that way. But it is interesting because I did ask a few women about if they see themselves as feminists, and some answered that no, we have a traditional view of men and women's roles in society. So it's like this unique kind of Ukrainian or Eastern Central European feminism that may not be identical to what we see as feminism in Sweden, for example. But that doesn't mean that you are, less strong or less keen to have your female rights. So I think where we're doing Ukraine is a bit of a disservice when we always look at it. So first of all, we look at war with male glasses, yeah? We look at it with a male perspective, but we also tend to look at the Ukrainian women from a Western gender point of view. And I'm not sure if that is very helpful. I mean, you can be, just to be like very blunt, clear about it, you can be, defending your country. You can be a very strong woman. You can help in bringing women to higher positions and help actively increase gender equality in the Ukrainian society without calling yourself a feminist, without agreeing to any feminist rules. So many Ukrainian women I've met have a very traditional view from a Swedish point of view of a family, of the woman's role, and so on. So I think that's important to take into account when we discuss gender aspects. Some things that would be obvious for Swedes would not be in Eastern and Central Ukraine.
No, yeah, I totally agree with you. I actually wrote my master's thesis on this topic.
Oh my God, you should just and hold the lecture about this.
Yeah.
Maybe
No, but it is very interesting with the perceptions and different concepts of feminism. Like, and there is definitely like an East and West, like kind of an American conceptualization and a European one, and then Eastern and Central European.
But what you can say, that even if you don't see it from any ideological perspective, right? The important thing here is that the Ukrainian women are right now the providers of their family. They are the leaders of their family unit. They are the defenders of their family, of their children. I mean, so many of them have more than 2 children. Some have 3 or 4, even 5 children, and they are some can't even speak English. They have never been abroad outside the borders of Ukraine, but they are fleeing to strange foreign lands, taking total charge of their family units, making sure their children are safe. And this is what happened after the Second World War. And that these experiences that women had, they didn't have a particular term for it, but the fact that they knew that they had been the successful defenders of their families strengthened them and gave them a whole new confidence. And they realized that this is what they are able to do without men. And I believe that this will be visible in Ukraine as well, because millions of women will share this experience of risking everything, of fleeing for hours and even days, and bringing their children to safety. It will be an incredibly empowering experience, and this will also be something that is brought through the generations, just like I write about in my book, the intergenerational trauma of like your grandmother being raped by Russian soldiers, and so on. You also have an intergenerational sense of strength and pride being passed down.
Yeah.
And women will know that this is what my mother did to survive. This is how she protected us during the Russian invasion.
Okay, so do you want to comment as well, Jessica, on the implications that on gender equality in Ukraine?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's interesting that we have like this on the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, absolutely, the war can tend to open up spaces and new arenas for women to take space, to maybe take new positions, as we mentioned, that gives them a new status that they wouldn't have had otherwise. But at the same time, of course, when a country is affected by war, society is also broken down, and that also leads to often a backsliding of women's situation and women's rights. So there is like both things playing out in parallel, I would say, and so it would be very useful, I would say, to keep this in mind. Like, what are the things that we should look out for to make sure that women's rights are not worsened in the coming period, but strengthened instead. And I mean, I have, of course, already mentioned the increase in men's violence against women and domestic violence. So this is likely to continue and also get worse unless we spend more attention and resources on this. And in addition to the things I mentioned previously, I would also like to add that, of course, we need to ensure rehabilitation, but also like a well-designed disarmament process to make sure that men are not carrying weapons in the post-war Ukraine, which tend to make these situations much worse and is very common in post-conflict societies. And another thing is that we insist on having that women really are taking place and are getting heard in these recovery plans and the plans that are being made for the country, to ensure that women, for example, are really included in the labor market as we go forward, that they have these economic opportunities, that they can continue to take on roles that are not traditionally women's roles in Ukraine, so that they're economically empowered in the post-conflict society. And also, as I said, a lot of militarized countries, women's knowledge are not always perceived as important. So important to keep an eye on women's equal political participation after the war. Another thing to pay attention to in militarized post-conflict societies are women's sexual and reproductive health rights. It's quite common that women and girls are pressured to have more children in post-conflict societies to make up for the lost generation. And this can have very detrimental effects on women's abortion rights, for example. LGBTQI rights can also be threatened, has the tendency to be more threatened in militarized societies, where traditional roles of what's male and female are becoming more celebrated. So, yeah, in short, there are a lot of things to look out for to ensure that Ukraine does not cement old-fashioned gender roles and gender equalities, but instead become a more inclusive, democratic, and gender equal country after the war. But also great hopes that they can do that if we pay attention to it.
Yeah, I think that one thing that we haven't touched upon is also the fact that that many families have become divided because of the fact that Russian, I would think, Ukrainian men are not allowed to leave the country, and so most of the Ukrainians fleeing war zones and going to other countries has been women and children. And I'm just thinking that this must also have some impact on the future of like gender equality, and because we have these splitted families and we don't know when they will be reunited. And so far, right now, with the current policies, the EU policy, it's quite easy, as I understand, to come back and forth between Ukraine and other European countries, but still there is the fact that the children and women are divided from their husbands. How do you think that this will impact on society, I guess, as a whole?
I can say something briefly, maybe. I think that, of course, if there is like a huge difference in the population, that there is a much bigger male population, this can, of course, lead to different problems, and maybe also as increased sense of insecurity for the women in the country. But I also think that this is why, once again, looking at the recovery funding going in, the recovery plans, why it's so important that Ukraine really hopefully is able to build up a society after the war that is attractive for women, so that women want to come back, that there is jobs for women, that there is opportunities for women, and so that the women who have left the country really want to come back to the country and feel like they want to be part of rebuilding the country, and that they have a good opportunity to have a good future in the country. So this will be extremely important, I think, to have a successful future.
I may also add, it's very important to ensure that women will be able to find job and have like economical security in Ukraine. But another reason why they're staying away, or why they're hesitant to come back, is the childcare facilities and healthcare facilities, which have been greatly damaged. And as we see from the recent events, they are often targeted by Russian military. So ongoing war and the risk of a kindergarten or school to be bombed, or the fact that children have to study in the basement, is also a very considerable factor for those who are abroad not to come back for the time being. So talking about the post-war recovery process, healthcare, social services, and childcare facilities are also very important to provide certain level of stability and security in Ukrainian society, which would encourage people to come back or stay in Ukraine.
That's a very, very important point, which is actually, like you say, hampering women from returning now already if they want to, but then again, focusing forward, that this is something that needs to be prioritized. I think we are getting close to the end of this conversation. I'm wondering if any one of you would like to add something.
First, I want to add, I'm looking at the comments. I don't see any questions, because something came up and it said, if you want to ask questions, it's in the chat. Can you confirm this, that there are no questions?
Yeah, no, there are no questions.
Okay, just a few hellos. Okay, good. So we don't take time away from if someone wants to ask something. Well, I have just two things I want to say. What can the international community do in regards to the gender aspect of the war in Ukraine? Well, first of all, we can help integrate the Ukrainian women that are probably going to be staying for longer than they hoped. Many thought that the war would end this autumn. They said at least it's not going to go on for longer than this winter. And now we are unfortunately heading into the second year of this war of invasion. So there will be some interesting upcoming seminars about, for example, how to integrate Ukrainian women on the Swedish job market. And how they can be helped. So that's something very practical and important that we can do. The second thing the international community can do when it comes to awareness of this is, of course, looking at legal strategies of convicting Russia for these war crimes they are committing against women and girls. Looking at the Balkans, looking at Rwanda, and taking cues from there. And I know, of course, Ukraine has been putting Russian soldiers on trial ever since last spring. So they are really prioritizing this. But it's crucial for women and girls' rights across the world in conflicts that they do not get away with this, that it will be a proper reckoning for Russia for their sexual crimes against women in Ukraine.
Yeah, I hope that I agree with you. I really hope that we can work on the mechanisms to prosecute all these war crimes and war criminals, to get some justice for not only for women but for everyone who has been suffering from this war. So I guess then we'll just wrap up this conversation. I would like to thank our guests, Lisa Bjurvall, Jessica Kojamrell, and Anna Kvitt for participating. Thank you so much. And I would also like to thank my colleague Anna Johannesson, who has been supporting and running all of the technical stuff in the background. And last but not least, I would like to thank everyone who joined and listened. And you can also find more information about Sweden for Eastern Partnership Project in the event and on YouTube and our webpage. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.